No doubt one of the most fundamental skills our students need to perform in our classes is argumentation. And to the students and to us teachers, we might as well be asking them to solve a Rubik's Cube without knowing any of the algorithms.
I got one line.
And yeah, there's always that one kid who's like... But for the most part, our students struggle with this most basic of skills. So in this video, I'm going to tell you what I think are the foundations of supporting arguments with evidence, and if that's the kind of thing you're into, stick around. And here's what I've discovered when trying to teach my students how to make historical arguments. They struggle to do it because they don't know how to build an argument, period. Not just a historical argument, just a bare, naked argument. So that's when I realized I needed to do some remedial work with them on argument building, and since I used to teach formal logic, I decided to use those resources. So I brought them down to the basics of arguments, and I told them at the very bottom, there are only two things that make up an argument, a premise and a conclusion. And I tell them that the conclusion must be supported by the premise and the premise must imply the conclusion, and then I give them this example. Heimler is a history teacher and Heimler is definitely bald. Therefore, all history teachers are bald. So we've got two premises here and one conclusion. And I ask them, is this a good argument? And of course they say no. Okay, good. Why not? Well, because all history teachers, they say, are not bald. And I say, well, how do you know that? Well, because Mrs. Crandall is a history teacher and she's not bald. Ah, okay, so you have an experience that disproves my conclusion. That's great. That's called an appeal to experience. Or if you had a database cataloging the heads of every history teacher in America, then you could appeal to that authority and prove me wrong. Great. But then we need to go one step further. By appealing to experience or authority, you're only dealing with the validity of my conclusion. So now we need to look at the argument itself and see if there's any flaw in the argument. So is premise number one true? Yes. Is premise number two true? Yes. So why isn't the conclusion true? And it's here where they start to understand the dynamics of argumentation. They say something like, well, just because one history teacher is bald doesn't mean that all history teachers are bald. Yes, that's absolutely right. But then I tell them that we determine when the argument is sound not based on the truth of the conclusion, but on whether the conclusion follows from the premises. In this case, the conclusion is unwarranted from the premises. So then I ask them to fix this argument. What could make this conclusion valid in light of the truth of the premises? And the funny thing is, it's actually a very simple fix, but they struggle mightily to see it. And the fix is this. Heimler is a history teacher, and Heimler is definitely bald. Therefore, some history teachers are bald. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a valid argument. And so then I go through several examples of good and bad arguments so they can begin to see the dynamics of premises, conclusions, and good argumentation. And when they have that down, then we can move to making historical arguments. Okay, so now that we have basic argumentation in place, I put a historical argument on the board and we dissect it for premises and conclusions. And for this, I usually just pull theses from the released College Board samples. So for example, here's the thesis from LEQ number 2 in the 2021 APUSH exam. And I would encourage you to pause it for yourself and identify the premises and the conclusion. By the way, if you teach APUSH or AP World, I've got lots of argument building exercises in my teacher resources for those classes, and that link is in the description. Anyway, here's the thesis. Transatlantic voyages in the period from 1491 to 1607 greatly affected the Americas by introducing new diseases to Native Americans and animals, the destruction of the environment, and especially change in the way of life for Native Americans. And so then we analyze the internal validity of this argument, starting with the premises. Is it true that Europeans introduced new diseases to the natives of America? Yes. And then I asked them to name some of them. All right, so smallpox and measles. Okay, great. Okay, now what effects did those diseases have? Mass death in many populations. Okay. Now, premise number 2. Is it true that Europeans introduced destruction of the environment? Now, this one's a little shakier and they're going to have some trouble with this. Europeans did introduce the idea of land ownership in the Americas, which fundamentally contradicted many native cultures' relationship to the land, but destruction of the environment is a little harder to prove. We'll leave that premise alone for a moment and we'll fix it later. Okay, is premise number 3 true? Did Europeans change Native Americans' way of life? Yeah, from changing the social hierarchies to coerced labor, etc., it was a big change. So in light of these premises, does the conclusion follow? Were the Americas greatly affected by disease and coerced labor and changing social hierarchies? Yes, that is a valid conclusion. So then we need to figure out what to do with premise 2. If you look further in the essay, the student actually uses that paragraph to talk about the Columbian Exchange. So we could change that premise to say the introduction of new food and animals, and then we have a solid conclusion held up by 3 true premises. And so I just do this exercise with them over several days with different valid and invalid theses so they get some practice with it. Okay, and now that they can see how a historical argument works, it's time for them to build their own. It's one thing to observe arguments that other people make and be able to dissect them, but it is another thing to build a valid argument yourself. So I start with baby steps. I put them in groups and I give them a conclusion. Industrialization fundamentally changed social structures in Europe. New commercial practices led to significant change in Afro-Eurasian trade from 1200 to 1450, whatever. Then their job is to produce the premises that would make that conclusion valid. Then I put their premises on the board and we decide as a class whether the conclusion follows from the premises. If they don't, then what do we need to change to make it valid? And we do all that work up there as well. Now, I don't know what this sounds like to you, but at least in my classroom, this can be a very lively discussion because to the students, it's kind of like a puzzle that they have to figure out. And when they do, boom, dopamine hit to the brain. And once they have figured out the internal dynamics of how arguments work, the next step is to figure out how to interpret a document and then use that to support a conclusion, and that is what we're going to explore in the next video. All right, click here for more teacher tips to use in your AP classroom. Don't forget to check that link in the description for the teacher resources for APUSH and AP World. And if you want me to keep making these videos, then by all means subscribe and come along. Heimler out.